connections there that I'm kind of starting to unpack and quite excited to get into now. The other sort of thing that I should mention about critical technical practice is that I became an academic quite late in life. And at the age of 39, I started a PhD. And I had a whole career before that where I was working in civil society organizations, working on digital security and privacy policy, mostly in the global south with women's human rights defenders and journalists and activists. And so I did that between India, where I'm from, and then I moved to Germany. And so used to work as a security trainer and with communities in different parts of the South kind of facing censorship and surveillance and things like that. So and I was always a researcher in those contexts, and I kind of made a switch to becoming an academic, which is a whole other story we can talk about at some other point. So I'm interested in how, as a feminist practitioner in that civil society space who was a researcher, but my knowledge was not as highly regarded as, let's say, usually a man who is a cybersecurity expert, and feminist knowledge is not widely recognized and understood as knowledge. Things might be changing now, but and I find that, in teaching AI, just this morning at 7:15, I was on a call with another conference with mathematicians and physicists at Cambridge, and basically all their questions to me related to why is the human, social, cultural, and political dimensions of AI ML, why should we study these things? Why should we know about them? Because it's all about the models, right? It's all about the data. It's all about the compute. And if we can just fix that, then everything's going to be fine. All the harms and risks and things we're seeing will be sort of managed. And basically, they were like saying, your course, the masters that I teach, like, who needs it? Because it's all about just fixing the data, right? And I was like, well, if it was that simple, then you wouldn't be calling me to this meeting. You'd fix it. You'd go and fix it. There wouldn't be any harms. But anyway, I'm not a mathematician or physicist, and I work at a science university. So you have to be very careful about that. Okay. So this is kind of situating the talk and where I come from and these kind of different influences on this space. I think because it's on Zoom or yes. Okay. So I'm going to start off with this provocation, the end of theory. I'm going to talk about what that end of theory, that provocation that was made in 2008, what it means for the world after that, between 2008 and now, draw out some reflections from that, and then how that led to the shaping of this field called AI ethics, the 3 waves of AI ethics. And then I'm going to make a switch towards, I'm proposing that we need to move from AI ethics to critical technical practice and try to draw out some examples that I think might be interesting to this group, given the context of your work, and say that CTP is kind of here already, and what do we need to do to make more of it? So, you know what? If I stand up, will the camera catch? Not will they catch this?
It's fine. You can stand up.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Because I kind of feel like I usually do this. Is it okay if I do this? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can use this clicker. You just click to the next slide.
Great. Okay. And I just want to make sure it's okay for people on Zoom also. Okay. So this is an essay. There was an essay written in 2008, an op-ed actually, written in Wired magazine, which is quite a known sort of tech optimist, bit of a booster magazine. And the chief editor at the time, Chris Anderson, he proclaimed the inauguration of the big data era. He proclaimed big data is upon us. And it's a great essay, op-ed. If you have not read it, I recommend that you do. And he says many things in it. And one of the things he says is, this is a world in which massive amounts of data and applied mathematics replace every other tool that might be brought to bear. Out with every theory of human behavior, from linguistics to sociology. Forget taxonomy, ontology, and psychology. Who knows why people do what they do? The point is they do it, and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. And as somebody who works between the humanities and social sciences, this immediately got under my skin in a way that, and hopefully a productive and generative way to be like, what? And I also find it kind of interesting that he's making a taxonomic error there, when it's like, why would you put taxonomy, ontology, and psychology like together? I'm sort of, what is he talking about there? Anyway, so there's this quote, and elsewhere in the essay, he goes on to say, if this is the case, then why do we need to study culture in the way that we do? I mean, think about language, like Farsi is the same as Klingon, basically, because can all be reduced to these data points that we can make connections between. And the work of translation then becomes a data task. And so if we think about what is the world that big data has wrought, and there's a bunch of stories here, and you maybe know many of these because they've been in the news, over time. I've kind of put them, just selected examples from incident databases. I find the sort of incident databases that we have now of harms and risks emerging from AI, ML, and automated technologies absolutely fascinating, because just the way that they're architected, how they get data about harms and risks, how they verify the harms and risks emerging from these systems. So the Dutch, and I've also picked things that have to do very much with the public domain. There's a lot of things happening on social media and other spaces, but I've chosen just not to talk about social media here because that's a whole other thing. And I'm thinking specifically about applications of data-driven technologies in the public sector. So if we think about, since 2019, the Dutch government has been embroiled in a scandal after the country's tax authorities used a self-learning algorithm to create risk profiles in an effort to spot fraud among people applying for childcare benefits. I should just say again, if I'm going too fast, if you want me to stop or say anything again, please just put a hand up, virtual or in Meet Space, and I can stop and go over something that you want to ask about. So authorities penalized families over a mere suspicion of fraud based on the system's risk indicators. Tens of thousands of families were pushed to poverty because of exorbitant debts to the tax agencies. Some victims committed suicide. More than 1,000 children were taken into foster care due to the scandal. The criteria for the risk profile was developed by the tax authority, and there were kind of interesting variables in this. So the most notable ones are having a dual nationality and low income. What this ended up doing then is that it targeted the poor and targeted ethnic minorities and immigrants. The authorities started claiming back benefits from families who were flagged by the system without proof that they had committed such fraud. And the court recently actually forced the government to withdraw this. They said they couldn't do it. Then there was the case of the A-level algorithm in the UK, where because of the pandemic, kids who were leaving school and going to college, they couldn't do their exams. So the National Education Authority, Ofqual, made their own standardization algorithm to kind of predict what would people's grades be based on the grades they had already gotten. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was that kids who went to fancy private schools ended up somehow getting higher A-level grades than those who went to state schools and from like poorer neighborhoods. So they were sort of targeting postcodes, zip codes, pretty much. And then you might have seen, there were kids on the street, like 16-year-olds, with signs saying F the algorithm, which you kind of wouldn't normally see because you can't actually F the algorithm. You ask for accountability, you don't ask to F it. Another case, I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly because there's a lot to get through. The robocalls and debt, the robo-debt case is also from Australia, is also like the Dutch one. It's the Australian Tax Authority developed an algorithm to identify fraud, and lots of people, 500,000 Australians got these random calls about how, about how they were in violation and they were actually not. And then these three at the bottom are really historic, significant, important. You've probably heard about all of these cases. So Doctors Bulamwini and Gebru's Gender Shades Project, which I'm going to talk about. Maybe I'll just click to the next slide and you'll see the pictures. Oops, what did I do?
It's
the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this project, very historic project, which I think kind of like shaped and gave a lot of shape to the understanding of bias and discrimination. This project is from 2018. based on Bulamwini's work at that time. And in fact, this week, she's doing like book launches for this book, Unmasking AI. So you should definitely check it out because it's the story of how all of this came together. Now, what happened was Joy was trying to test this facial recognition technology and then found that it was not working on her face, but then it was working on the face of her white colleagues. When she wore a white mask, the system recognized her, and the rest is history. And then in 2018, Bulamwini and Gebru did this project where they tested the facial recognition systems of these three companies, Face++, Microsoft, and IBM. Face++ is Chinese, and found that using a particular scale, the Fitzpatrick scale, so it's not just about race and gender, they used a specific scale which identified phenotypes as more male or more female, and darker, lighter skin, and found that some were more efficient than others at recognizing the diversity of the faces that were identified. Now, what was interesting is, and I don't think people often recognize it, the purpose was not to just say, make these systems better, but to say, let's start looking into the architectures of these systems and where they come from and why we have them and who's kind of subject to them. So just to go back. And then,
Here, let me try this and see if that works. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. And then Compass North Point is the one that was written about by ProPublica first in 2016. This was an algorithm to identify the risk of recidivism, so reoffending, and it disproportionately flagged Black people who were incarcerated as more likely to reoffend rather than white people. This was widely sort of discredited in the press. But what was interesting was what North Point said, that, but the algorithm is fine. The algorithm is actually working fine. It was doing everything it was intended, it was architected to do. I think that's the sort of chilling point. And my favorite story, favorite case is so much older, and is I think something that is not in the canon, if there has to be a canon in this field. Professor Sweeney is a unbelievably illustrious professor at Harvard and is the first Black woman who got a computer science degree from MIT in 2001 and has been like the CTO of the Federal Trade Commission. And it was in 2019 comparing how people with different names got served ads on Google's AdSense. Google's AdSense was quite different at that time. And so if you had names that were sort of racially situated, then particular kinds of names, then you got more ads related to bail and incarceration and things like that, including Professor Sweeney herself, because this was how and this is kind of how the work started, because it kind of recognized her name as like more Black as opposed to somebody called Jill or Emma or something. Okay, so these are some sort of, this is the world that Chris Anderson, I mean, not to kind of like, go after Chris Anderson, but this is the world of data that we live in. These are all the systems that are being made better ostensibly. So where does that kind of leave us? So this is machine learning working as intended. Machine learning is a vast pattern-making, pattern-finding apparatus. It relies on correlative approaches through data that must be selected, cleaned, made suitable for use, and things like homogeneity, scale, uniformity, these things, you all know this really well, all need to be in place before you can actually architect these systems. But if you continue to take data from free sources such as the internet, and especially if we're using these technologies in the human social world, which are not in controlled lab contexts where you can just say, here's all of the data we have about a particular genome or something like this. You're getting data from the internet and from censuses and, very, very varied and diverse sources. So that data is going to replicate the world that it comes in. But more interestingly, because of this correlative function, it also starts creating new relationships that may not be in the world, more kind of like bizarre circumstances and outcomes, because it's just about kind of, making patterns and finding these combinations. The other is that machine learning is constituted by algorithms that the historian of science, Lorraine Daston, refers to as thin rules. This book is fantastic, highly recommended, very, very readable. In her history of rules, Lorraine Daston identifies algorithms as thin rules that are not intended for, quote, a predictable, stable world in which all possibilities can be foreseen. Algorithms do not invite the exercise of discretion and are an instance of operations divided and subdivided into steps so small and unambiguous that even a machine could execute them. On the other hand, she writes, models are thick rules, whereas algorithms are thin rules, because they are upholstered with, quote, upholstered with examples, caveats, observations, and exceptions, end quote. So that's a nice kind of distinction that she makes. The other, and of course, I mean, in all of these things, there's, the model, the algorithm, the data, they're all kind of in this entangled relationship where one constitutes the other, right? So a lot of work, as we'll see in AI ethics, about accountability, which tries to say, well, show me the algorithm and show me the data and show me the model. These things are not all separate and can be looked at the way you might something else in a courtroom, for instance. So what happens when data scientific approaches of, these kinds of approaches to data and data science are applied to social scientific problems? Are the problems of predicting criminal reoffending, fraud, the pandemic, are these data science problems? And how do we make the distinction between, in a social science, in the world of humans and social relationships, what part is amenable to, is legible to data, and what does it mean if we bring data to start architecting the problem and architecting solutions? I'm saying that if we do have fixes and solutions and approaches that come from data-driven technologies like machine learning, then we need to sort of understand what the stakes are in that, what the trade-offs are in that, and how they're going to reshape what happens in that world. And the other is that, applying machine learning to sociological issues requires the inputs of experts in those fields. Why do we think that criminality or education or any of these things, why do we think that these are not areas of, expertise, of legitimate expertise? And I want to shout out to another great paper, a little difficult maybe to read, but interesting if you kind of continue on this journey. It's a very master's level paper, I would say. So, if you try some of these things and feel yourself really struggling, don't hate yourself. It's fine. Lots of people struggle with it. The Logic of Domains by David Rebus et al. And I'm happy to leave the slides, and the references are there so you can follow up. And one interesting point they make in the Logic of Domains is that to the world of data and data science, everything is a domain that data science can be applied to. And this is kind of recalling for us Anderson's line about, the data will tell us what the thing is, and the data will give us the answers as well. Because I think data science, machine learning, I'm using these words interchangeably, are helping us, it's supposed to work like an operating system. You can put it into anything and see how it works, and it will be the expert. So what happens to expertise then in that case? And these are and this is kind of what we have to think about when ML is also a tool. Many people will talk about it being a tool, talk about it being a solution, but these things are also owned largely by extremely inordinately powerful companies that have relationships with states and pretty much, cannot be held to account right now. And I think there's really great, things that people are trying to do to bring accountability, bring regulation to these companies to say that you cannot just sort of continue in this way because there's lots of harms. And sometimes that's seen as like, sometimes it's seen as like, you're focusing too much on the harms, and you don't want, fun stuff to be made with AI. And I don't think that's entirely true. Like, show me the fun stuff. I want fun stuff to happen with AI. So I think that reckoning with power is really important. Now, moving to what this means for AI ethics. How are we doing for time? What time is it?
We're good. We're at
5:28. At this point, does anybody want to question, clarification, or just a feeling that you want to express or anything like that? If so, then now is the moment. Otherwise, if not, we'll move on. Hi. So what these kinds of cases and examples, the stories that were on the slide before, these incidents, what they have kind of generated is a lot of concern and the shaping of this field called AI ethics. And there's a lot to say about AI ethics. It's mostly a sort of industrial academic construction that is concerned about the applications of AI broadly, but all of these algorithmic and data-driven technologies. Now, Carly Kind writes about these three waves of AI ethics. And so in a little over the past half decade of applications of machine learning that have proliferated in domains such as finance and banking, social welfare, cultural curation, education, health, and criminal justice and retail, so have concerns of bias, discrimination, and unfairness. So you have these terms, AI ethics, ethical AI, and also something called FATE, F-A-T-E, fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. There's a very well-known conference that exists now called FACT, F-A-C-C-T, fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning. So a lot of people who work on machine learning and data-driven technologies will kind of go to this conference and from across industry and business. So these responses, ethical AI, AI ethics, their intention is to mitigate and prevent the negative outcomes of machine learning. As a result, scholarship and practice in law, computer science, data science, business and policy, and software product design have become sites for values-driven approaches to machine learning. But, says Carly Kind, how they contribute to this reshaping of technology along the lines of different sets of values is far from widely agreed upon. Kind actually lays out these ideas in a piece called Ethical AI Has Finally Come to Mean Something. That's where this is coming from. She says that the term ethical AI has come to mean something because of its current third wave, and writing in 2020, she was writing about a third wave. So the first wave was about high-level principles. So when all of these stories of harm were coming out, people were saying, we need to look at driving this technology with some principles. So they were like, I don't know, at first like 82 and then 134 and, sets of principles, everybody from the UN to the Japanese Robotics Society to, every sort of industrial engineering body, they all had their sets of principles. And they all pretty much said the same thing, that, human rights is important, fairness, accountability, transparency is important. And I love in my course, there's 1 week that we do on from principles to practice and kind of just going through all of the different principles documents and what they say. And it's amazing that, we like to talk about cultural differences, but across the world, these are sort of like standard values that people have. So that was the first wave. And then the second wave is this understanding that, the bias that Buolamwini and Gebru saw or that, other people identified, we can fix this. Okay, this is a data problem. It's an optimization problem. It's a problem of weighting, as in like weights, not waiting.
Yeah.
And we can fix this, and it will be fine. And there are many instances of things that have been fixed. And in fact, I was just, talking to the mathematicians this morning and saying that, Safiya Noble, Dr. Safiya Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression. Now, that book was based on her putting some search terms into Google around like professional hair and Black girls. And if you put those things into Google now, the results you get are Safiya Noble's book. So there is change, there is transformation. I mean, Google's word embeddings had like in translations, imported a lot of biases in different languages, and they found a way to change it. So things are kind of transforming. There are many things that are possible through data science and through the kind of computational tweaks and fixes we need to see, absolutely. What that has led to, however, is sometimes this understanding that, this is where the fix will come. But actually, some of these questions are a lot larger. like this bigger question of why do we need to automate some of this decision making, or what parts of the decision making get automated, or who's overseeing that process, and where are the experts, the kinds of things we talked about before. So Kind writing in 2020 at the time of protests following the global condemnation of George Floyd's killing by police, as students in the UK were protesting algorithmic determination, and as Dutch courts ordered a complete halt on the use of algorithmic fraud detection tools. Kind was talking about this third wave of political, infrastructural, and social concerns associated with these technologies. Now, Kind suggesting that you have these waves, first, second, third, sort of suggests that there's a linear evolution of thinking about these technologies, but it doesn't actually happen like that. And I prefer to think about them as tributaries, because I think that they are all they are interconnected, and we have very similar sets of actors and stakeholders in them. So if we think about them then through discussions of power, inequity, and justice in response to societal harms, then there's one tributary which might be from human rights law. There's another one which might be about values and ethics from a sort of quite analytical philosophy perspective. That's also very significant in thinking about AI, about waves of AI ethics. And I feel that now maybe we're coming to see a fourth wave, and I'd be curious to see if Carly writes about a fourth wave. And I think the fourth wave that is really about the hard ecological limits of things like generative AI, because I find it amazing that even someone like Sam Altman will say that the costs are eye-watering. And what that means is the energy cost to actually run these things is just like some other level, and we don't actually have the planetary resources to do this. And in fact, in one of the workshops that we're doing with my students, somebody, professor, was showing how he was using generative AI technologies to image models, so he was using image models to create avatars for his Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And somebody in the class actually said, this is a massively frivolous use of these technologies. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to deal with this one. I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues who are also gamers to deal with this. So that's the fourth one. Now,
Can I ask a quick question?
Please.
So going from the high level principles to now a little bit more these other secondary and tertiary waves, in the high level principles, were there ever any instances of thinking about social injustice or the way? Okay, so no. The high level principles were what primarily then? Were
things like human rights must be central, which is okay. The problem is you can say human rights must be central, but then you also have inequity and discrimination going on at the same time. And the fact that you have principles that are in conflict with each other was not recognized by the people who instituted these systems in the first place. They just kind of listed the principles. So justice, transparency, accountability, fairness, non-discrimination, and people wrote about what those things mean, but not what they mean in the context of AI/ML, but also what it means when they're in conflict with each other, and how do you resolve those conflicts. And a lot of work at this level, at this time, was about framing the problem as an ethical, philosophical problem, and not how do you work through it. That's a very, very different kind of stage and process. And that's where some of the more kind of messy things start happening when you try to work through it. And that's kind of what we are, I think, grappling with in the course that I run. So, this course was started in 2021. That was our first cohort. So just, out of the pandemic, and that really shaped the start of the course, because my colleagues, I was not there and kind of architecting the course. I was one of the first people hired to run it with two colleagues. And the concern was that things were still at this principles level, and that people didn't actually know kind of what to do with it. So this is a 2-year part-time remote master's it's called an MST, a Master of Studies, and usually only like Oxford and Cambridge have an MST. And this is for working professionals. So what's really interesting about my students on the MST as opposed to like my MPhil students is these are all people who they work in finance and banking, they work in Google, they work in Meta, they work in the military. They are the people actually procuring the systems. They are the people with oversight over these systems. And this is kind of the reason why I took the job, because I was thinking, there are people in all of these systems out there who are concerned. They all come in saying, this is not good. We need to make it better. But they're part of those systems and often don't have power and agency within them and want to know, how do I understand it? How do I start framing what is the ethical issue? And how do I kind of improve it? So this is, people are concerned about their complicity. They're concerned about the moral compromises they're making. They want to think about care. They also recognize that, just by them doing something and doing a course, is anything going to change? Maybe not. So that's one big part of it. And, located accountabilities, there's some references there around this idea that if you're in the system, is it on you to make it better? And what are the trade-offs in this one individual doing something and the entire rest of the company not doing anything, or the infrastructure that feeds that company not doing anything? What is the role of that individual and where does it end? And I think this is a much larger question for our time, when we are very aware of ourselves as individuals who we feel we want to talk about issues, or we feel like, we must stand for something, and then that will be part of a much larger change. And it can be really hard because we sometimes feel alone, or that the man is much bigger, the systems are much bigger, we can't do anything. So I think this is a very live and important topic for people everywhere today, I think, in lots of different places. The other thing I'll say about the program is, that I find really challenging and interesting is that we're very situated in the humanities and social sciences. I'm employed in a research center that is kind of in the philosophy faculty. Our degree is awarded by the degree committees of philosophy. But, my colleagues work in critical race and gender studies. They're cognitive scientists, they're psychologists, behavioral economists. So there's, historians. I run the course actually with a historian of science, and bringing these approaches to bear on data science is hard, because people will say, like I was telling you the anecdote and, from this morning, they were like, what do you know about it? It's just about like fixing this stuff, and we can do it and it's fine. But I guess not, because we find that, we just welcomed our third cohort in, and it's challenging for people who have power. This course has taught me a lot about dealing with power once you're in the room with it. All of my education has been about identifying and analyzing power, but never really about how to deal with it when you're confronted by it. And in the humanities, that's one of the things that we try to do. And I think that's part of the challenge, part of the problem. I think sometimes in the humanities, we do need to ask ourselves, what are we doing and how are we doing it, and how does it make sense to people? We need to keep asking ourselves this question. So I've been trying to move towards saying that something else, towards this idea of a critical technical practice, because I can see my students wanting to do something in the world, and sometimes they want to translate literally what's happening in the classroom to their colleagues. At other times, they're thinking more carefully and strategically about where they're going to try and influence things. So for instance, I have one student in the first cohort who works for a large retail bank in the UK, and he works in their wealth management team. But he started getting really interested in the data protection, data privacy, and he wrote a paper in the philosophy term about hyper nudges, algorithmic hyper nudges. Should we be using them for good? Could we use them for good, and how would it be architected? And he used that to kind of talk to people in the data protection team about how are your algorithms made. It's not like he was going to change anything, but because he had done some of this work, he was able to then have conversations with people. So we see students actively trying to make this change, and I feel like it needs, the scholars, anthropologists have studied this. it needs community, it needs really robust documentation, it needs people to sort of come together and work out what techniques actually work and what is the purpose. Sometimes students feel like if it's not changing things at the biggest level, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't. And that's not necessarily true. So I then go to the work of a very legendary computer scientist, quite a mysterious figure called Phil Agri. I'm still not pronouncing his name right. I do it wrong every time. And I'm like, there's always somebody in the room who's like, actually, it's Agar. And I'm like, Agri, I think it's Phil Agri. What's interesting about Phil Agri was that he worked as an AI scientist in the 1980s. And in 1997, he wrote a really important paper about a critical technical practice. He did his PhD in the AI lab at MIT. So he was very much in that wave before the AI winter happened. He was like in the 70s, 80s, like watching the emergence of AI and studying that field. Phil Agri ended up actually dropping out of the academy and kind of just leaving it all behind because he couldn't deal with a lot of things that was happening. He had a lot of his own mental health issues, I think, going on, but he left behind some he's still with us, I believe. But he left behind some really interesting writing that I was reading it again in preparing for these talks. And there were some bits, of course, that I didn't understand because first and foremost, this piece is from he's writing between 1988 and 1997. It is about a very specific time in the shaping of AI when you didn't have a lot of the data or compute that you have now. So, but you had some of the original thinking around how AI was going to be shaped. And there was a lot of focus on how we understand reasoning, how we make plans, how we execute things, because these had to be sort of coded into the system. So they had to kind of like shape the architecture of AI. And I'm going to read some of this stuff now because it's a little bit quite specific. So one challenge he describes in this piece that he writes about CTP is how AI practitioners were a unique and already highly interdisciplinary community, yet quite isolated from other fields of practice and study. So in this article, he kind of identifies these gaps between how AI scientists, as a very unique set of people, was separated from a lot of others who actually understood the very domains that they were working in. So we come back to this logic of domains, that why is it that people working in AI even then thought we're making like this master technology that can go into anything? They did not think to include the perspectives of people from other places. They also, Agri says, modeled things on their own behavior. And at the same time, they did not have a lot of introspection into what their actual behavior was. So a very sort of surface way of kind of referring to this might be, I mean, it's surface, but it matters. I don't mean to say that it's thin, that, these were all like these very privileged white male, computer scientists in MIT and, Berkeley and Stanford, imagining these systems, and they were going to model it on themselves. Yes, indeed, these are the sort of the, people who kind of started these waves of AI. And I don't want to get stuck on just that piece, because I think that there's larger institutional capture of thinking as well around AI at that time. And they focused it, they wanted to make something which mimicked the human, but they didn't do much kind of introspection into how they as humans were also doing kind of thinking and processing. So what Agri's work was actually about something called concept formation, concept learning, which even in AI today, people don't understand how we make concepts. And our generative models, like, are they really great stochastic parrots or on steroids? Or is there something else going on? And I think that's in terms of making concepts in a particular way. And I think that's a very real and interesting challenge that the top cognitive scientists are still thinking about and like trying to figure out. And I would like to not kind of bring too much of my own kind of confirmation bias or ideologies into that. But I've heard some people talk about this, and I recognize that it's a very serious debate that people are having about what's going on, because this then has all kinds of downstream implications for what does oversight look like? How can you reshape these models if you want to think from the perspective of harms and risks? So Agri is writing about his world of concept learning and concept formation. And he developed something called intermediation, paying close attention to how things were really executed, how things were really done. So he went on this very introspective journey of saying, how do I plan something? How do I learn something? And maybe he got a little bit lost in that as well. And it sort of comes through in the paper that he writes. But it was a response to his own work. And he says that he had always seen concept learning, concept formation as mathematical in terms of lattices and matrices, mathematical concepts, but he had never really thought about what conceptual learning was actually about and how it actually happened. So he said, as an AI practitioner already well immersed in the literature, I had incorporated the field's taste for technical formalization so thoroughly into my own cognitive style that I literally could not read the fields, literatures of non-technical fields at anything beyond a popular level. The problem was not exactly that I could not understand the vocabulary, but that I insisted on trying to read everything as a narration of the workings of a mechanism. And I feel that today, sometimes, when we say, make it better, we're asking for a blueprint of like, literally tell me how to make the system better and, looking for like technical specifications. And unfortunately, I think it's more messy than that. So the piece is difficult to read and it goes back and forth, but it's really interesting to see how he evolves this very unique sort of hermeneutic practice of talking to people, of listening to music, of reading in fields he had like no understanding about. So the last quote from him is how talking to colleagues at MIT, they got him reading Heidegger's Being and Time, very difficult European philosophy book. Would not recommend, but if that's your thing, go for it. I tried to read it, it's very hard. Or Garfinkel's very famous Studies in Ethnomethodology. Quote, at first I found these texts impenetrable, not only because of their irreducible difficulty, but because I was still tacitly attempting to read everything as a specification for a technical mechanism, end quote. And I love this line, I still remember the vertigo I felt. And so real, like who doesn't feel that, when in this moment, especially we're like all being asked to like be experts in this and also understand that. And that is the kind of information ecosystem that we're living in now. And it is so hard. Real interdisciplinarity is so hard. That's why many of my colleagues don't like it because it's hard. So I've been sort of thinking about this kind of what might a critical technical practice look like, where you want people to be experts in their own field, but also start learning about other fields, doing things through the lens of other practitioners, but also have these experiences of vertigo, of feeling overwhelmed. And I feel like as an educator, then my role is to say, let's create a space where you can do that and feel the vertigo, but this is like, some padded room in which you can feel the vertigo and do experiments. And so so my research project that I'm starting, and we're going to start this month, I'm using a participatory action research methodology, happy to talk about that separately, to actually just do these, I'm calling it a community of practice methodology, which is quite established and feels like education. Just going to bring a bunch of people together, like my students, but their networks, to say, let's talk about how you talk about and what you're doing on AI ethics and form a community of people who are helping each other. Gonna see how that goes. So that's one thing that is outside the university, but I'm trying to do similar things within the university. And I don't think people like that because it's much easier to be in our little niches. Why would you want to do the harder thing, right? But I think some of these things kind of need to be done. And I'm intrigued by it because I'm intrigued by the social process that's underway. And as a social scientist, I'm interested and I'm very influenced by thinking around ethnography and the way people are I feel I'm embedded in a particular moment when this is all coming together. And I'm seeing so many fascinating things about the way experts are coming together, the way lay practitioners are coming together, and everyone is being transformed. And I want to be able to capture that process. And I also want to, so that's the kind of thing I'm hoping to do with my students, which means also that I want to change how we assess, how we teach. I don't think people should be learning about writing Cambridge essays about histories of AI or, philosophy. I think they need to do projects, but how would you market? How would you test it? Who's going to do it? These are kind of very chewy administrative challenges as well. And I find myself kind of getting involved in that, but it's part of the story. So now just to sort of come to the last bit, at this point, shall I stop, pause? I'm going to just get myself some water.
I can get you some water.
Okay,
I can take some
thanks.
questions.
If there's anybody who wants to, or if you need like a break of any kind, because I realize it's been a lot, I've just been like talking at you. So if you want to stretch or ask a question or just say something. Yeah, please.
So what do you say to, about this is very interesting, as it's precisely stuff that I've been looking into.
Can you tell me your name, please,
My
and
name
what you
is
do?
Whitney.
Okay, Whitney.
I was actually at Oxford last year,
Oh,
and
okay.
I visited Cambridge for a long time.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Are you attached to any college?
Hughes.
Hughes. Okay, yeah, we have the same Hughes as well. But anyways, what would you say to people who, what do you think about regulations and how effective that is? And if there were to be, say, an international regulatory body, like an FDA, but international level for technology, how would you solve, or how would you think about the issue of these bodies usually being truthless, and how would you enforce these regulations and ethics considerations?
Yeah, great topical question right now. There are different models that people are proposing. So you could have the FDA, you could have something like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the experts are split on like, is AI like nuclear or is it not? And there, you can actually argue it both ways. What's more important is thinking about that regulation from different perspectives. Are you trying to regulate the sort of upstream business commercial entities? Or if you think about, for instance, something like CERN, CERN is a regulatory body of a very different kind. It's about scientific cooperation between people from around the world. The IAEA is a very different kind of organization. The FDA is very different. So first, we have to become specific about what kinds of regulatory mechanisms are we asking for, and each of them is like its own field of study, and I think they all actually have value. So one that I can talk about that I'm a little bit involved with is actually out of the Oxford Internet Institute, and it's called the IPIE. And it is only about misinformation in the ecosystem, in the internet ecosystem. But more interestingly, it's a research organization. And it's saying, how do we arrive at methodologies to identify that research about the information ecosystem that we're in is legit research? And what are the sort of good approaches, techniques in this field that people need to be knowing about? So that's a very different kind of approach. And so maybe I'm not fully answering your question. I'm trying to say that it's a huge topic right now. And I think that it's like the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is, I just love that title because it's kind of, I mean, the movie's also great, but it really speaks to these multiple kind of temporalities and situations that are unfolding at the same time. And then there are lots of others who will say, this is not an AI problem. This is an institutional problem. AI is kind of bringing it to the fore right now because there's a lot of money and there's a lot of attention to it. Many people who work in it will say, there's no robot apocalypse that's going to happen. There's other things that are going to happen along the lines of, like a bad kind of information apocalypse kind of situation where something is going to be triggered by generative AI and, all of these things. Those things can happen. We've already seen egregious harms happen. So we will see others as well come about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that you gave me many resources to think about, but what would be some repercussions or consequences that could be implemented in place so that companies don't do this? Like, for example, GDPR, it's finding Facebook or Meta is finding a lot of companies, and companies are actually afraid of breaking GDPR, right? Would something like financial, repercussions or,
Yeah. I mean, I think without a doubt, regulation of the sort of big tech ecosystem is so necessary, and it's coming. I mean, I think what Leena Khan is doing here at the Federal Trade Commission is fantastic. Where they're going into things like antitrust, and they're looking at AI technologies as market products that consumers of different kinds will use, which is very different from the moral arguments we might make about these companies, either in terms of their wealth or their power. And this is what I mean by sometimes those of us who are aligned with particular political positions or epistemic positions, we need to bring different kinds of empirical arguments to what's going wrong. It's not just about like, well, they have too much power. You know what? People like power, and they will validate and value people who have power and allow them to have power and just try and get closer to them. Yeah. So try to find other ways to do it. So I think that there are, I mean, all of these companies are like being fined so much by the EU, which is good. It needs to happen. But then they also have very highly paid lawyers who will allow them to get around it. Not a thing has changed. I mean, there are some enclaves in Europe where, yes, it is possible to have these kinds of protections under things like GDPR.
Just paused ads earlier this month in Europe, right?
Oh, did they? Yeah. Actually, they did. Yes, and
well, it's just temporary because they're implementing like a subscription tier, which is also
exactly. See, so there's always some way around it, but it goes without a doubt that we actually do need that. But is it okay if I just move on because I saw two other hands? Yeah.
Questions, and I have to leave, but thank you very much for.
Welcome.
How long does this go on for?
I should end soon. I want to like go through these three examples. Okay. Let's take one more question if that's okay, and then I'll move on and we'll come back. Yeah.
I guess it wasn't even really a question, more of like an inquiry, but like as an urban studies like student, I kind of wanted to come here because I saw it on Instagram, so I posted it, and also I was just thinking about like my thesis, which is about like music and how it kind of like transforms landscapes. So I think like even the idea of just like trying to incorporate like this notion in academia, sort of like an interdisciplinary lens, I feel like, I don't know, this is not advice, but I feel like maybe an urban studies like view could be really interesting, like if like your university has something like that, because I feel like I know a lot of urban studies students who are kind of like thinking about AI, particularly as it kind of concerns like geography and like GIS and et cetera.
Totally. And such an amazing space to be working in, of course, with someone like Saima, who's an expert in this and has many years of working in this. I mean, you're in good hands, but this is also like a great city and ecosystem in which to be doing this. And I'm hoping that I'm going to start a project with some collaborators called AI in the Street, which is thinking about these kind of spaces where there's no one person who's responsible for this sort of shared space of the street, and lots of things are being implemented at the level of the street. I think this is an amazing space to work in. And I'll talk about an example now that I hope maybe will speak to some of the music concerns as well. So I'm going to just move ahead to some of these because I'm aware of time. So these are just some examples of what I think might be things like a critical technical practice, because they are very collaborative and they bring together, I think, people from different disciplinary and technical backgrounds from across different places. So this is one of my favorite projects ever in the world. And I don't know if you clocked this, but Time magazine had this 100 in AI big cover story, lots of people whose names are in AI. And as somebody who studies things like media and ideology and values and metaphors and narratives, like that was great. But I also really see it as like that's pure ideology, because I think this kind of project needed to be on that list of Time 100. So the Fair Work Foundation says, we want to make like gig and platform work fair and equitable. How do we do it? They have a rating system that they have generated through working with partners in 23 countries. And this is work that is gig work, cloud work, micro work. So, the way that people tag things online is quite different from delivery workers, very different, like architectures, ecosystems, labor conditions. But they are, so across these different domains in these 23 countries, they've come up with what does a good workplace look like for people working in these companies. They're looking at labor laws and practices in country as well as international agreements, and check out their reports, check out the way they do the ratings. I mean, all the companies that you're using are evaluated and rated, and very, very detailed metrics. What's really great is in many countries, companies want to improve their ratings. And for me, there's nothing better than that. If a company is actually reading the report by researchers and saying, oh, we've got a terrible rating and they want to improve, that's a big deal, and the argument that often comes from, gig work and crowd work and micro work is that, well, it's giving people in the global South, like, opportunities. And yeah, that's true, but it doesn't give them a career. It doesn't give them progression. It doesn't give them a lot of things we would expect of jobs. It might be money that's helpful, but not beyond that. So I think what great about this project is they've got a very specific, like, nice package of this. These are ratings. This is how it works. You can implement it. And then a lot of, like, political and social questions emerge from there. So this is a nice example. And then the other two are more in the realm of kind of like arts and culture, and with the generative technologies. So these are two projects that have come from the University of Chicago. There's Glaze and there's Nightshade. And these are sort of mostly adversarial kind of approaches, where the context is artists' work, visual images, visual content going into large diffusion models without permission, just like scraped from the internet. So what Glaze does is it sort of introduces some kind of perturbation into images. And this is all developed with artists, so that it prevents models from being able to effectively use the original work. So the original work gets glazed, as in pottery, with something around it. So the model doesn't actually touch the original, but like a version of the original. And then they just released Nightshade, I think like a week or 10 days ago, which is about poisoning. So it actively injects poison into a model that tries to adopt it. And it's so sort of like clever and witty and thoughtful. And it's like professor working with a bunch of students to, and they're written about an MIT tech review and whatever.
He came a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, did he? Did he? I think his name is Ben Zhao.
Yes, he was at Columbia.
Yeah. No, great work. And it's so sort of like, there's like cartoons and, and it's working with communities of artists to kind of actually test this and develop it. So I'm like such a fan of people who work in these ways. Very, very clever. And then the last example I'll talk about is an artist and computer music researcher called Holly Herndon and her partner Matt Dryhurst. And they have and she's a voice artist, and this work is all about like voice cloning. And Holly is interesting because for a long time she's been thinking about decentralization and decentralized systems, but also what she makes, her voice and music, as things that people should be able to use. Spawning is the sort of new umbrella of tools. They are artist tools, AI tools for artists. So how can artists actually be part of working with AI in creative, interesting ways without losing control of their content, and then doing kind of interesting experiments with generative AI in ways that work for them? So check out Spawning. There are two projects right now. One is called Have I Been Trained? And that's to help artists identify if their works are already in training data sets and to allow them to opt out of that. And that's actually been adopted by, I can't remember, one of the big companies, I think it's Hugging Face, is working with Spawning right now to try and integrate it into their technologies. And again, fantastic, sort of outcome. And it's interesting to think about being in the moment and saying, this is what it needs. But they've obviously been building this for a long time. You don't do this in like 2-3 weeks when, the technology comes out. So Have I Been Trained? And then the new one is Holly Plus, which is a way for, this is in the voice cloning and music space, for ways for musicians to control use of their data and use of the likeness of their voice or image, in this context, voice, in generative AI. And Holly is a kind of quite interesting figure this way, in how she's technical and political and, kind of interesting ways. So I think I'm going to like leave this there. I think that's my last slide. And these are all the references towards the end. And yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.